who wrote the Gospel of Matthew? For 17 plus centuries, there was no debate on this issue. Everybody knew the answer was the Apostle Matthew. The early historians are completely unanimous on this topic. However, in the last couple of centuries, there has been a strong, sustained effort to try to discredit Matthean authorship. One of the principal motivations for this is philosophical. When New Testament studies were influenced by 19th century philosophy, there was a dogmatic opposition among many scholars to anything miraculous or supernatural. Matthew was in a special place here because everybody knew that Mark and Luke were not written by eyewitnesses. John is what many have referred to as a spiritual gospel, but Matthew served as a solid historical anchor, tying Christianity and its core beliefs to the witness of an eyewitness, someone who was there at the time. Matthew was far and away the most popular gospel in the early church. I've described it earlier in this series as the foundational text of Christianity. For those who wanted to discredit the supernatural claims of Christian belief, it was necessary to discredit the Gospel of Matthew. In this video, I will provide a deductive argument looking at what we do and do not know about authorship, and I will respond to some of the arguments against Matthean authorship specifically and eyewitness authorship generally for the Gospel of Matthew. It is widely claimed that the earliest attribution we have, where the text we know today as the Gospel of Matthew is attributed to Matthew, comes from the late 2nd century. Well, we do have solid attribution from the late 2nd century, but I will present in this video a novel, logically valid, deductive argument showing that we can actually trace that attribution all the way back to the 1st century, and I will show that it is possible to do so without appealing to Papias. Not that there's anything wrong with using Papias as a source, but because the testimony of Papias is itself a subject of such virulent debate. That's not the focus of this video. Now, the key here for the principal abbreviations I'll be using the abbreviations to make the logically deductive steps more apparent. The text refers to a text that is in form and content essentially what we know today as the Gospel of Matthew. Minor variations through scribal harmonization, scribal error are not relevant to this argument. A sub x, the text was attributed by X. WK, it was well known. CA, it was considered authoritative. AA, it was attributed to an authority. S refers to a substantial stir or debate over a topic. Sub I by Irenaeus, and sub AF by the Apostolic Fathers. Premise 1. The text was attributed by Irenaeus to Matthew. This is not a remotely controversial premise. Everybody knows this. Premise 2. The text was well known among the Apostolic Fathers. When we look at where it's quoted by Ignatius, it's quoted by Polycarp in the Didache, probably in the Epistle of Barnabas, and if Edward Massot is correct in his research, it's quoted in 1 Clement as well. Massot has shown that unusual Greek words in Matthew show up in exactly the right place and form in 1 Clement to suggest Clement is indeed not only familiar with Matthew, but quoting directly from it. We could make the argument without 1 Clement if we wanted to, but I actually think Clement should be included. What we have then, and we could add a few more authors if we wanted to add a few more years on the end of the timeline, but what we have is a wide geographic dispersion of people among the Apostolic Fathers. That's the 2nd generation Christian leaders, the people who took over leading the church from the apostles. We have a wide geographic dispersion among the Apostolic Fathers of people quoting the text we know today as the Gospel of Matthew. This is not then a text that's just sitting in one church somewhere in Antioch in some isolated group of Christians. No, this is a text that's doing really well. It has obtained a great distribution. It's showing up all over the Eastern Mediterranean. The text was well known. Premise 3. The text was considered authoritative by the Apostolic Fathers. When we look at how they quote it, these are the words of Jesus, as it is said in the Gospel. They quote it the same way they quote Paul. Perhaps even more strikingly, they quote it the same way they quote the Old Testament. Christians learned from the Jews how to treasure and revere their sacred texts. For them to quote a 1st century document on the same level and in the same way with the same authority they're quoting the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, is an incredible statement of authority. These are Christian leaders who were willing to die for what these texts said, and some of them did. This is not a case where This text just showed up in the meeting house one day. We have no idea where it came from, but let's read it and see if it's good. No, this is something that was considered authoritative. They lived by these words. When we see the role that the Gospel of Matthew plays in the 2nd century, again, as ably demonstrated by Edouard Masseau, this is a text that was considered authoritative by the Apostolic Fathers. They trusted these words, that these were the words of their master. Premise 4. This is where the use of symbols will be helpful in tracing the logical deduction. This says, if not attributed to an authority by the Apostolic Fathers, then not well known to the Apostolic Fathers and considered authoritative by the Apostolic Fathers. In English, that means that if they didn't attribute it to an authority, that these two statements cannot both be true. This doesn't say who the authority was, just that they had to be able to provide a credible provenance to this text. One of the remarkable things we see about the Gospel of Matthew being well known at this time is early Christians debated an awful lot of topics. They disagreed about many, many things. My church says this was handed down by the apostles. My church says this was handed down. For the text to be circulated and quoted as authoritative so widely, they had to be able to provide a justification for doing that. Whoever that authority was, this is anonymous on its own, but they had to attribute it to some authority, or they wouldn't be able to do this. They would not be able to circulate this document all over the empire, treat it as authoritative, quote as authoritative, unless they could provide a credible provenance for the text. We actually see this is exactly what happens in later years when other texts are questioned. Well, where did this come from? What is the authority on which this text hangs? These are exactly the variables that later Christian apologists would use to defend the texts that made it into the New Testament and to oppose the texts that did not. There had to be a plausible provenance for the text, especially among the Apostolic Fathers. These are people who heard with their own ears the testimonies of the eyewitnesses of Jesus. They did not need to rely solely upon a text in order to know what was said, what doctrines are considered to be true. They had received it themselves. And so if the text were not in harmony with what they had received, the text would be rejected. That's exactly what the Christian churches did with subsequent texts. In fact, even generations after the Apostolic Fathers, the claim, "I have it on the authority of the earliest elders," was still considered a weighty, authoritative statement, even in a world with lots of written documents. And so the text of Matthew could not compete in this way unless it was attributed to someone authoritative. Premise 5. If both the text was attributed to an authority by the Apostolic Fathers and there was no substantial stir or debate on the attribution of the text, then the attribution by the Apostolic Fathers equals, or is the same as, the attribution by Irenaeus. In English, what this means is if they'd wanted to change the attribution over this generation, there would have been a stir, there would have been a debate. It's not saying they couldn't have changed the attribution, it's saying that to do so would have caused debate and division. We actually see this regularly in early Christianity. When doctrines or traditions or practices are challenged, there is substantial debate. Christians debated everything from, did Jesus really have a physical body, to what is the date on which we should celebrate Easter? And the authoritative claims, or what they said were authoritative claims, handed down from the earlier generations, were used to settle these disputes. Something as important as the foundational texts of the Christian movement was precisely in the crosshairs. We see this when people tried to introduce additional texts, or when people like Marcion tried to throw texts out or edit them. This subject was right in the crosshairs. It was prime material for objections to Christianity by its detractors and changes to Christianity by its heretics. And yet, premise 6, there was no such substantial stir or debate. We know the principal topics that Christians were debating because the writings, the bestsellers, have made it down to our time. We also have a pretty good idea what the vulnerabilities were in the eyes of Christianity's detractors, because we have their arguments either preserved by Christian apologists or directly handed down to us. And so we can see these are the things that Christians were debating. These are the areas where they were considered vulnerable. This is where the apologists had to play defense. Irenaeus of Lyon is a great example. He is absolutely shredding the claims of the Gnostics in his work. Before doing so, however, He tells us what the Gnostics believed. Now, over the years, there were some grounds for questioning, is Irenaeus presenting their views accurately? Enter the Nag Hammadi library. When this was discovered, we could actually see what the Gnostics believed, and it turns out Irenaeus really did know what he was talking about. He has presented the views of the Gnostics quite well, and then proceeded to tear them apart. We see other Christian apologists following a similar pattern. This is in the crosshairs. This is a subject of significant debate. What texts are authoritative and why? And so if they try to change the attribution, well, we used to tell you it was written by so-and-so, but now we're going to tell you this instead, that is a prime target for opponents of Christianity to say, look, you can't get your story straight. Now, there is a claim made by some that the Gospels were anonymous, and that it was Irenaeus, or a contemporary of Irenaeus, who put the names on the Gospels as we know them today. I'll refer to this as the Great Conspiracy Theory of Irenaeus, or GCTI for short. The GCTI has significant flaws. First, because Irenaeus isn't our only source for the names of the Gospels. Let's say Irenaeus really did invent these names and try to enforce them. The church didn't have any centralized structure in the 2nd century to change that everywhere, to get everybody to believe it. So what are they saying elsewhere in the Mediterranean? Clement of Alexandria is on the opposite corner of the Mediterranean. He's an extremely well-informed scholar. He represents a different branch of thought. He and Irenaeus actually disagree on a number of things. He's got his own sources of information, and Clement names multiple gospel authors and agrees with Irenaeus every single time. So if Irenaeus, or one of his buddies, invented these names and is responsible for this conspiracy, Clement of Alexandria is in on it. He would know. He has material from the early elders as well. So now you've got both ends of the Mediterranean, both in on this. Very different schools of Christian thought. They're both in on this. This conspiracy is getting a little bit unstable. Tertullian in Carthage joins Christianity a few years later, and this gifted lawyer just buys the story hook, line, and sinker. He defends the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Origen of Alexandria, a pupil of Clement, representing the pinnacle of Christian scholarship in the early 3rd century. Never in any of his travels, in any of his studies, does he ever encounter anyone who says, you know, when I was a kid, they didn't used to call the Gospels by these names. Not a whiff of doubt expressed anywhere in Origen's writings. And Origen is a pretty good scholar. He tells us when he's not sure about something. But when it comes to the authorship of Matthew, there is no uncertainty. And yet we're trying to claim that his own teacher Clement was in on the conspiracy? This is the kind of conspiracy that gets so big it collapses under its own weight. There was no way for the decentralized early church to do this without causing a stir, without causing a debate. Look at the things they debated. This was material that would have engendered a debate, both among the factions within Christianity and the critics from without. Yet we can look at the records, and there is no debate on this topic. There was no ground to stand on to oppose the declaration that Matthew wrote Matthew, because everybody knew it. You couldn't get away with that debate. As important as the subject was, nobody could debate it because everybody knew it. It is, as Zahn put it, a statement that, circa 180, was incontrovertible. What does that mean? Well, let's look at how Irenaeus constructs his arguments. There's much historical value to be gleaned by doing so. He argues from premises to conclusions. In his premises, he presents things that are not particularly controversial, things he expects his audience to know, and in particular, some of his premises he doesn't even have to defend at all. These are well-known statements. Everybody knows this. You can just put it as a premise and leave it there. It's untouchable. He then uses that to derive the conclusions. These are the controversial points he wants his audience to believe. We may disagree with his reasoning on how he gets to his conclusion. In fact, I do disagree with some of Irenaeus' conclusions, and the deduction by which he arrives at them. But the historical gold in Irenaeus is what can he put in a premise in the year 180, knowing that nobody can challenge him. When Irenaeus tells us that Matthew wrote Matthew, he does so in an undefended premise. He knows no one can challenge him on this point. And so, as Zahn put it, that means that at the time of Irenaeus' writing, this statement was incontrovertible. There was no stir. These are our 6 premises. None of them make particularly outlandish claims, and you may have noticed I followed a process similar to Irenaeus. 6 premises, none of which are terribly controversial, but 5 of them, premises 2 through 6, I did actually provide some support, because once people see where these premises lead, I know they're going to want to poke holes in my premises and say, well, this doesn't work. So I provided some background to show why I think these premises are reasonable. But premise 1, That the text was attributed by Irenaeus to Matthew, I didn't defend that one, because I know I don't have to. Everybody who has studied the issue already knows. It's incontrovertible. Let's now see where these premises lead. Conclusion 1, logically deducted from the premises above. The text was attributed to an authority by the Apostolic Fathers. That follows logically and necessarily from premises 2, 3, and 4. Conclusion number 2. The attribution of the text by the Apostolic Fathers equals the attribution of the text by Irenaeus. That follows logically and necessarily from premise 5, premise 6, and conclusion 1. Then our final conclusion, conclusion 3. The attribution of the text by the Apostolic Fathers was to Matthew. That follows logically and necessarily from premise 1 and conclusion 2. This is a logically valid deductive argument. What that means is you can't oppose the argument by saying, I don't really like the conclusion, or there are scholars who disagree. No, the only way to defeat a logically valid argument is to show that one or more of the premises is false. If the premises are true, this statement is logically proven. Now, what have we proved? To be clear about what we've proved, this is not a logical proof that Matthew wrote Matthew. This is a logical proof that the Apostolic Fathers attributed the text to Matthew. But if the Apostolic Fathers, from here on out we're looking at an abductive argument, if the Apostolic Fathers, people taught by the apostles themselves, the second generation of Christian leaders, said that Matthew wrote this text, that is incredibly solid historical evidence for Matthean authorship. That is really, really good grounds, because these are people, a variety of people, who know what they're talking about. In the remainder of this video, I'd like to address several arguments that are sometimes raised against Matthean authorship specifically, or eyewitness authorship generally. We'll start with some arguments by Richard Bauckham. Bauckham suggests that Matthew did not write the Gospel of Matthew. His principal premise relies on his belief in Markan priority. He believes the Gospel of Mark was written first, that Matthew used Mark as a source. And he says, why would Matthew, an eyewitness, have to rely upon the work of Mark? He wouldn't do that, especially when Matthew recounts his own call as an apostle in Matthew chapter 9. He's quoting from Mark. Well, this assumes Markan priority. If you've watched the previous videos in this series, you know I don't believe in Markan priority. I went through each of the major arguments for Markan priority and showed that they are circular or reversible or both, and made the case that the best interpretation of the evidence is that it was indeed Matthew's gospel that was first. So to those who believe in Matthean priority, Baukham's argument carries no force. But it is worth addressing the broader claim here because it's made in many camps, that an eyewitness would not quote the work of a non-eyewitness. Oh, this happens all the time. Anytime a survivor of the Titanic, the Hindenburg, Pearl Harbor, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, quoted a journalist who wasn't present, you have an eyewitness quoting a non-eyewitness. And yet that happened all the time. The only assumption that is needed to explain why the eyewitness would do this is they thought the journalist put it well. This is not only not unthinkable, it's not even uncommon. But in the case of Matthew's call as an apostle, this is his own story. Why would he have to rely upon another source for that? Well, let's grant, for sake of argument, Markan priority. I don't really grant that. I don't believe in Markan priority. But let's grant it for sake of argument and see where that takes us. Why would Matthew quote Mark's account of his own call, Matthew's call, as an apostle? Well, if Matthew is as self-effacing and humble a guy as the rest of his gospel leads us to believe, he doesn't want to draw a lot of attention to himself. So he says, okay, my story's in there, Mark gave a quick summary. I'll go ahead and include it because people are expecting me to, and they know I'm the one writing this, but I'm not going to draw any more attention to myself than I have to. This is entirely plausible. It's not particularly difficult to explain why Matthew might do this. Interestingly, though, one of the most common arguments raised in favor of Markan priority is the shorter is earlier dictum. That is, the shorter version is the earlier version. Mark is the shortest gospel, so it must be the earliest gospel. People can see why later authors would add or embellish the content, but they can't see why they would leave things out. This is a real problem. This is a real problem for this story, the call of Matthew as an apostle in particular. The story of the call of the tax collector to follow Jesus is provided in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But when we compare the accounts side by side, Matthew's version is actually the shortest. and Mark's is the longest. So if we were to adopt the shorter is earlier dictum, that would mean Matthew's account is more original, and it is Mark who has added details to the account. This is one of the reasons why I don't use shorter is earlier. I don't think it's a good criterion from which to try to solve the synoptic problem. Whatever gospel you want to pick as first, I can give you examples where they have a longer account than one of the gospels that supposedly copied from them. So no matter which gospel you pick as first, we can find contradicting examples for the shorter is earlier dictum. That said, I don't believe in Markan priority, and so Baucham's principal argument has no force against my view. That I don't believe Matthew did copy his call from Mark. There's another argument that Baucham makes, though, a more general argument that may cast some doubt on what we know about the historical figure Matthew. This comes from his evidence from names, and I don't mean to critique his research in names. He's an expert in this field, but he makes an argument that does not follow from his evidence. He says, we know it was very common for Jews to have a Hebrew name and a Greek name. Yeah, we got lots of examples of that. But it was very uncommon, not quite unheard of, but very uncommon for a Jew to have two Hebrew names. So yeah, you can have two names, but not two Hebrew names. That's just not the way they tended to do things. But when we compare the accounts of the call of the tax collector as an apostle, in Matthew, the guy's name is Matthew. In Mark and Luke, he's referred to as Levi. Most people who have compared these accounts side by side have said, this is clearly the same story. Matthew and Levi must be the same person. Baucham says, no, they can't be. Or at least they almost certainly can't be. Because that would mean he has two Hebrew names. Matthew coming from the Hebrew Matityahu, or a name similar to that, and Levi very obviously being a Hebrew name. I challenge Baucham's assumption here. We can't make a deductive argument because one of those premises is far from certain. Why do we assume that the name Matthew came from a Hebrew Matityahu, or some variation on the name Matityahu? All of the texts have his name in Greek. It's Mattheos. So why could not this be a man whose Hebrew name was Levi and his Greek name was Mattheos? We have no historical support, no textual support to say that that name, Mattheos, in the Greek texts is a translation of the Hebrew name Matityahu. We could assume that. So well, they recorded it in Greek, because of course the gospel is written in Greek, therefore the Greek name in the gospel is just a translation of a Hebrew name. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. There's no reason why a man in Galilee could not have a Greek name, Andrew, Philip, and there was also no rule that said that a person's Hebrew name and their Greek name had to mean the same thing. So there's no deductive argument to be made here, because the name Mattheos, what actually shows up in the texts, is a Greek name, and that could have been his name. He actually could have been called Mattheos, not Matityahu. Since either of those options remain open, there's no deductive argument to be made here, and we cannot conclude, through logical deduction, that Matthew and Levi are not the same person. In comparing the accounts, I'm going to go with they are the same person. The story is quite clear. They're intending to tell us a story about the same person. The last argument I'd like to consider is the claim that if we can show that the Gospel of Matthew is a compilation of multiple sources, that would rule out eyewitness authorship. On what basis? There's no reason why an eyewitness, or even multiple people, including eyewitnesses, could not get together and compile a document. In fact, as early as the 2nd century, prominent Christians are already repeating the view, their belief, that at least one of the Gospels did originate in just this way. That multiple prominent early Christians got together, compiled their stories, and said, okay, one of us is going to be the editor who's responsible for putting it all together, and we'll put their name on it. But multiple people contributed to it. So early Christians had no problem at all with the idea that you could have multiple authors contributing to writing a gospel. I don't take a dogmatic position on that particular question, whether you've got multiple people involved or just one editor gathering information from many different sources. So even if we can show that Matthew is a compilation of multiple sources, I don't think that says anything at all about eyewitness authorship. But let's take one specific example, one prominent argument that is sometimes used to show we've got two different people at work here. And that is the way in which Matthew quotes the Old Testament. There are, broadly speaking, two distinct patterns by which Matthew quotes the Old Testament, and he quotes the Old Testament a lot. In the words of Jesus, in the dialogue, when Jesus is teaching and he quotes the Old Testament, Matthew tends to follow pretty faithfully the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. But in the narrative portions of his gospel, where he's just in the background telling the story, saying, this was done that it might be fulfilled, that which was spoken by the prophet so-and-so, in those portions of his gospel, the text is closer to the Hebrew Old Testament, but it could be more appropriately described as a good paraphrase of the Hebrew. So you got two different patterns. They hold up fairly consistently, by which the author is quoting the Old Testament. Clearly this is two different people and somebody later somewhat sloppily put their work together. No. The Clementine Hebrew hypothesis provides a very straightforward Occam's razor solution to this question. Why would the Gospel of Matthew quote the Old Testament two different ways? First, as a review, the Clementine Hebrew hypothesis holds that the Gospel of Matthew was originally composed in Hebrew and then later translated into Greek. So how did these two patterns emerge? Well, when quoting the words of Jesus, something we see across the Synoptic Gospels is they tend to agree more closely in wording when recording the words of Jesus than when they're just providing the backstory. They feel a desire or a need to be more accurate in preserving what Jesus said, and they feel much more free to use their own words when they're just speaking as the narrator. Furthermore, as Mike Licona has demonstrated, Jesus was an itinerant preacher. He would have told the same stories more than once, and so his disciples would have heard his teachings over and over and over and over and over again. And then, in the custom of Jewish rabbis and their pupils, the disciples would have gone out and told those stories over and over and over and over and over again. So you bet they can recite the words of Jesus with a pretty decent degree of accuracy. Furthermore, several have argued that as a Jewish rabbi, Jesus would have quoted the Old Testament accurately. And of course, as his stories are circulating in the Christian church, there's plenty of opportunity for people to go look it up on the Old Testament scrolls and make sure they got the quotes right. And when Matthew writes this down some years later in Hebrew, when he quotes Jesus quoting the Old Testament, he quotes the Old Testament with precision. It's a direct quote from the Hebrew Old Testament. But when Matthew steps in as the narrator, he doesn't feel the need to do that. For one, he's not reciting something that he heard Jesus teach over and over again. He's stepping in and recalling from his own memory. There's an Old Testament prophecy that talks about this. I seriously doubt Matthew went slavishly through every scroll of the Old Testament looking for, did Jesus do something kind of like this? No, how about this? How about this? No, he recalled from memory, from his own knowledge of the prophecies. This is a prophecy that has bearing on what I'm talking about, on the story I just told. And so what does he do? Well, often it's just a few words or a sentence, sometimes Isaiah or Jeremiah. He could go find it on the scroll. That's a laborious exercise. He, as the author, doesn't have to do that. He's not trying to regurgitate what the Old Testament said. He's trying to show his audience, who is already familiar with the Old Testament, Jesus did what the Old Testament said he would do. And so Matthew doesn't have a problem providing a good paraphrase of the Old Testament. He quotes it from memory. And as a result, these look like good paraphrases of the Hebrew because that's exactly what they are. What happens then when the Gospel of Matthew is translated into Greek? Well, as anyone who has done much translation of live languages knows, when you translate a phrase that is well known in the target language, you don't free translate it if you can avoid it. You refer to an already known, accepted, existing translation. If I want to translate Veni, Vidi, Vici, I'm not going to figure out that translation on my own. Everybody knows you're supposed to say it. I came, I saw, I conquered. That's the translation I'm going to use. When a good translator encounters a direct quote from the Hebrew Old Testament, as he's translating Matthew into Greek, the appropriate thing for him to do is to refer to the already known, existing, accepted translation. That's the Greek Septuagint. If he's a good translator, his job, he's not the author. He's not deciding how he wants to tell the story. He's translating what somebody else wrote. A good translator should go to that Septuagint scroll and use the existing Septuagint Greek translation. This is why, in the words of Jesus, we tend to see Matthew following the Septuagint pretty faithfully, because the translator did what a good translator should do. But what happens when the translator comes to a paraphrase? Well, the Septuagint now is not a rendering of Matthew's paraphrase. Matthew's telling it in his own words. And so the translator does not need to use the Septuagint, and in fact, would not be faithful to his source if he did. So the translator does free translate these passages. He does not defer to the authority of the Septuagint. And as a result, these passages in the narration portion of Matthew's Gospel look like good paraphrases coming from the Hebrew text. That's where they came from. As a result, we have two rather distinct patterns by which Matthew quotes the Old Testament. There's no need to hypothecate imaginary communities or people or steps in the transmission process. There's a very straightforward Occam's razor explanation for why Matthew would have done this and why the translator of Matthew would have acted upon the text the way he did. In conclusion, we've looked at some popular arguments against Matthean authorship specifically and eyewitness authorship generally, And we've found that they don't really hold water against the arguments I'm presenting here. That there is no reason to rule out Matthean authorship unless we have a philosophical commitment to a dogmatic opposition of the miraculous. That's why a lot of people oppose eyewitness authorship of Matthew. But if we just let the historical evidence speak for itself, we find, through a logically valid, deductive argument, that the belief that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew is not something that was invented in the late 2nd century. We can trace it all the way back to the 1st century, to the 2nd generation of Christian leaders, to the Apostolic Fathers who knew the eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry. If they believed the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew, and we just showed that they did, that is an exceptionally secure historical basis for concluding that Matthew really did write the Gospel that bears his name.